Good Monday to you. Welcome to the Better Message. I'm Pastor Dan Torkelson, senior pastor of Mount Olive Lutheran Church here in Madison, Wisconsin. It is Monday of Holy Week, and we were going to talk a little bit about Holy Week and really all that took place on Holy Week. Try to get the order as right as we possibly can. We're going to get into that here in just a second, but it is, for those of you who haven't been watching, it is an absolutely beautiful day outside today. It is Monday, March 30th, and we are looking at 75 possibly degrees outside before long, and this is what I love. I love to see an early spring. I kind of wish Easter was a week earlier. We could have had a really lovely day yesterday for Easter. Not sure how it's going to look later this week, but I love this. I'm not a winter person. I'm a spring person. This has been tremendous. In fact, it's been so tremendous to add to the fun that the Brewers swept their opening series after a marvelous comeback yesterday as well. And I want to congratulate a certain particular member of the congregation who I'm not going to name by name, who is a UConn graduate and is probably rejoicing in what was one of the more amazing uh, um, uh, it was a Elite Eight game yesterday between UConn and Duke. One of the more amazing games I've seen in the tournament in quite a while. One on a kind of a last second 3-pointer. It was, I don't know, that was like 35, 40 feet, and the guy nailed it. So congratulations to that member. He knows who he is when he watches this. I'm just not going to name his name, but let's get into business here. Let's talk a little bit about Holy Week because it is Holy Week. It is Monday of Holy Week. I've noticed over the years that Christians have a pretty good command of what took place on Sunday, or at least what began on Sunday, Palm Sunday, what I'm talking about here. And they have a pretty good command of Thursday, Maundy Thursday. They have a pretty good command, too, of Good Friday as well, obviously, the whole schedule of things and how it all takes place. Saturday is not hard. He spends all day in the tomb. And Easter Sunday, that, interestingly, we probably should do a follow-up of this next week on the days following, actually the order of events on Easter Sunday and the days following all the way to his ascension, which I think I probably will do. That one won't take maybe quite as long as this one, I don't think, but it's not exactly something that's easy to put together. People ask me on occasion, how did the whole first Holy Week work? And I don't know that I can give you like a 100% certain answer on all of that. But it's not a bad question. The good news is it's not a question that's gonna, that's going to ruin our salvation. We're not going to get quizzed on it when we get to heaven someday. That's good news too. But bottom line, it's worth asking, and it's actually a good exercise in learning how to read the scriptures for meaning and for understanding, which is why I'm doing this. I'm actually going to show you some tricks here, some tips for how to move ahead as you read the scriptures and try to come to an understanding of things. We're going to try to construct what the full Holy Week, Sunday to Saturday, looked like. We're going to try to do this just from the Gospel of Matthew. We are a 3-year series congregation, and we're in Series A, which is basically the Matthew series. So we're going to do this out of Matthew, and when we do this out of Matthew, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking for certain indicators to give us an idea of how the time is moving from Palm Sunday all the way to really Maundy Thursday. That's as far as I'm going to take this today. And be a little bit of an exercise in what to look for when you're reading the scriptures to kind of answer those sorts of questions. Like I say, we're not going to be judged on this when we get to heaven someday, just like we're not, I've always joked, I'm thankful that I'm not going to be judged for knowing the good and bad kings of Israel in the Old Testament either. When I get to heaven, I would surely fail that. The good news is Jesus took the judgment for me, so we are in good shape in that regard. But let's talk a little bit about the full Holy Week. What did it look like, or at least Holy Week from, say, Sunday, the procession with palms, although there's no palms in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. There's only palms in John, quite interestingly. But the whole Palm Sunday triumphal entry to Thursday. Thursday is kind of a relatively simple day until the evening. But we will get into this. We'll start talking about this now. Let's talk a little bit about how we do this. What sort of method do we use to reconstruct the events of the entire week of Holy Week? Holy Week is pretty well documented in all the Gospels. But it is, at least when you get to Monday through Wednesday, maybe even Thursday morning, you can sort of reconstruct the order of events, but you can only do so to what I would call maybe like an 80% likelihood based on a lot of things. Let's talk about what those things are. This is where, when you're reading the scriptures, especially the Gospels, the Gospels often indicate Jesus's words in red letters, and thanks to DC Talk, the old Christian contemporary band from the 90s, we had that song, The Red Letters, which is a wonderful song. It's a beautiful song. That happens to be on my favorite DC Talk album. I always liked that album, an album called Supernatural, which also had a kind of a hit with a song called Consume Me, which I still love to hear to this day. But at the end of the day, I had a professor in seminary who kind of blew up my mind when it's actually the one I interviewed back in the summer, Dr. Gibbs. When I was taking a course on the Gospel of Matthew, he rather jokingly referred to the black letters. He said, there's life in the black letters too. Well, the reality is there's a lot of meaning and a lot of understanding, a lot of context in the black letters. And it's learning how to read what's there in the narration. That's what the black letters really are. Because the Gospels are largely what we call narratives. They're stories. In the story, the black letters fill in a lot of context, a lot of time references, a lot of audience references, a lot of things that really help us understand things. When you're looking at what Jesus is preaching, like in the Sermon on the Mount, it's really important to notice who the audience is. Notice those terms like disciples and crowds and things like that, because these are words with different meanings. And because they're words with different meanings, they might have different applications. We're not going to worry about that here today, maybe a little bit, but we're going to mainly be looking at the black letters from Matthew 21 into Matthew 26, into Holy Thursday, for especially time references, and see if we can piece together what the order of events really was. The narrative sections, the black letters, contain the most detail. They just help us construct the entire context of a text, including time references. Lastly, even with these time references, we're still left a lot of times with approximations. One has to allow for some time to take place based on certain other details that are given in the black letters as well. And that's especially true in Matthew's account of the Passion, not the Passion, of Holy Week. The Passion, well, I'm taking this right up to the foot of where the Passion really begins today. But the reality is, like I say, we're going to get to about, I'd say, 80% certainty of how it plays out. I'm going to give you the most honest take on it I possibly can. Let's move into how this works in Matthew. Let's reconstruct the week using the text of Matthew and see where it all comes out. In Matthew 21, 1 through 11, we have the account of the triumphal entry. That's not what we heard yesterday. Yesterday we used John 12. John 12, like I said before, it's the only account of the triumphal entry, and there are 4 accounts of it in the scriptures, in the Gospels, four different accounts of it. It's the only one that mentions palms, is in John. Matthew 21 does not mention palms. Mark doesn't. Luke doesn't. Only John does. But in Matthew's account, you have all the other stuff. You have the donkey. You have the kind of humble look of it all. You have the crowds turning out. You have them saying, Hosanna in the highest. You have them saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And the account ends on verse 11 when Jesus essentially gets off the donkey. What happens next is pretty immediate, and that is in verses 12 through 17, Jesus goes straight into, it would appear, according to the text, he goes straight into the temple and does a cleansing. I got a typo there, don't I? The cleansing of the temple. The cleansing of the temple. He does a cleansing. What's interesting here, too, if you throw John into the mix, John has Jesus do that at the beginning of his ministry, right away, like right after the wedding at Cana, which is his first public miracle. In John chapter 2, he goes down to Jerusalem, he goes in and he cleanses the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record this on Palm Sunday. They record it as happening sort of right away. Jesus gets off the donkey and he heads straight to the temple. I mean, how do you reconcile that? You've got one that happens at the beginning of his ministry. You have another that happens at Holy Week. You reconcile that by the possibility that he did too. And it makes interesting bookmarks, I guess you could say, on his ministry. At the beginning of his ministry, he goes in and cleanses the temple and says, look, the boss is here now, or the boss's son is here now. And then at the end of his ministry, getting off the donkey after having been hailed as the King of the Jews, Hosanna, and the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, goes and makes that message again. The cleansing of the temple happens on Palm Sunday. We see that in verse 12. The word then is really the only time word here. Then Jesus went into the temple of God. He gets off the donkey. What does Matthew go straight to? Then Jesus went into the temple of God, and then he did everything that he did there. And then at the end of that account, he goes out. Verse 17, then he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. Now, Bethany's maybe a mile or two outside of Jerusalem. And it gives you an idea of how the Holy Week worked, because Jesus is essentially commuting. He's a commuter during this whole time. I believe he spends the days in the temple, but pretty much does spend his time in Bethany, at least on Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night. Thursday, everything moves to the upper room, and we're going to get to that in just a minute here. But on Monday is where the text then picks up. Verse 18, after Jesus goes out of the city to Bethany and lodges there, in verse 18, now in the morning, presumably the next morning, that would be Monday morning, as he returned to the city, he saw this fig tree that he wanted to get fruit from, and it wasn't producing any fruit, and he cursed it, saying, may you never produce fruit again, which seems like a very strange thing to do, but there was, again, a strong symbolism to it all, too. I mean, Israel is the vineyard, and Israel, going back to the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 5, Israel's not producing good fruit all the way back in Isaiah when that is sung. And quite interestingly, Luke makes a bigger deal out of this than Matthew, but Jesus will tell the parable of the workers in the vineyard, probably Monday or Tuesday in Luke's account, which is him singing Isaiah 5, him singing the Song of the Vineyard. Israel is a vineyard. It's God's vineyard, but it is not producing good fruit, which is going to be proved at the end of the week when Jesus is sent by the religious leadership, by Israel's leadership, to a cross, which they were not allowed to do. They were not allowed to crucify people. Only Rome could do that, so they had to trump up everything and try to essentially threaten Pilate to do this, which is what they did. They threatened Pilate, and Pilate caved to it, is essentially what happened. But let's keep going. So it's Monday now, and on the way in, as he's returning to the city, he curses this fig tree. Then in Matthew 21, 23, probably well into at least Matthew 22, maybe about halfway into that chapter, Jesus goes into the temple and he starts instructing. Matthew 22, 15 through 26, 5. This is a large section. You get a few different time references in here, but what you see is the action kind of move away from the temple, which is happening on Monday, to a private location on Wednesday. At one point at Simon's house in Bethany on Wednesday. It would appear on Wednesday, but let's kind of talk our way through that. So later Monday afternoon through Wednesday, there's this continued questioning. The Pharisees, the Sadducees are bringing their questions to Jesus. They're trying to trip him up. They're doing this in the temple. By the way, the whole temple account begins back in Matthew 21, 23 with the Pharisees approaching Jesus in the temple and saying, who do you think you are? And that has to do with yesterday. That has to do with the cleansing of the temple. They were deeply offended by it, which, boy, that's a big question. It's a question I like to ask with that parable I mentioned before, the parable of the workers in the vineyard, which was pretty offensive to the Pharisees as well. And we talk about how the giving of offense is a sin, but quite often it's a reflection of our sin as well when we take offense. So Jesus is essentially giving a lot of offense here, but does it have to be viewed as a sin that he does so? No, because most of what he's doing here is telling the truth, and the truth sometimes offends. But I think it's important to understand that in this large section, from 22:15 through 26 verse 5, which I think takes us at least through the end of the day Wednesday, there are not a lot of specific time references here. So this is why we can't get to like a 100% certainty of how the week played out. The Pharisees' actions during their questioning probably expend some time too. They spend time planning, they're doing what President Bush called strategery, and that has to take some time, but it may not have taken a lot of time. So in 2246 you get this reference, and no one was able to answer Jesus a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. And I'm suspecting that that's either Monday end of the day or Tuesday end of the day. But finally, in Matthew 24, verse 1, you get this locational thing. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And what takes place after that takes place outside the temple. So Jesus is kind of driving to the temple. Now he's driving away from the temple. Spend some time, and this must have happened on Wednesday, spend some time with Simon in Bethany. And the passion essentially begins there. Matthew's passion account begins there. It doesn't begin in the upper room. But so when you talk about that section, Matthew 22, 15 through 26, verse 5, one other reference, which is a local reference that's kind of important, is 24, verse 3, now as Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. Again, outside of town, between Jerusalem and Bethany. Jesus is I think on Wednesday, he's not even in town very much. He does proclaim while he's still there in the temple these powerful woes against the Pharisees too, where he calls them whitewashed tombs and sons of hell. And he also gives an instruction on the last day that covers 2 chapters, chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew. It's called the eschatological discourse. Matthew's got 5 discourses, 5 longer sermons in it. The Sermon on the Mount, the parabolic discourse, that's the parables, the ecclesiastical discourse, which is largely that section on forgiveness in Matthew 18, the eschatological discourse, which is the end times. And so some people say that Matthew's structured around these discourses. I'm a little less inclined to believe that, but that's because I'm a student of Professor Dr. Gibbs from St. Louis. He has got other takes on how Matthew's structured. But anyway, during this time, it's a continued questioning. There's woes against the Pharisees and Jesus' eschatological discourse, and then he moves out of the temple and does not seem to return to it at all. Putting together the last part of it, Matthew 26, 1 through 15, he gives a prediction of his crucifixion and a start of his passion, which happens probably in Bethany, and certainly when he's at Simon's house in Matthew 26, Mary comes in and anoints Jesus' feet. That's in Bethany, and that is the proper beginning of the Passion account from there. Thursday, they find the upper room. They start preparing the meal. That's an all-day endeavor. So that pretty much occupied his day, and then we know Thursday evening there was the meal, there was the arrest, maybe the beginnings of a trial moving with the Jewish religious leaders, trial moving eventually over to Pilate earlier in the day on Friday, and then inevitably to his cross on Friday. And the rest of the story, at least to the resurrection, is pretty basic. But that's how you kind of construct it. So we put it back together. I have the preparation of the Passover here too, but if we put it all back together, Sunday is the triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple. Monday through Tuesday, maybe Wednesday morning, Jesus is teaching in the temple, sparring with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. On Wednesday, there appears to be a trip to Bethany, to Simon's house, and he's anointed by Mary. My guess is that he's there for supper on Wednesday, so the commute back out to Bethany for the last time. He's going to commute back in on Thursday. They're going to find the upper room. They're going to prepare the Passover. They're going to have the meal, the arrest on Friday. There's the trial, the flogging, the crucifixion, and on Saturday, Jesus rested in the tomb. And that is, it's particularly Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday on that list that are a little dicey. We know some things that did take place on Monday for certain. Then how the rest of it plays out across Tuesday and Wednesday, although I think the Bethany trip and the dinner at Simon's house is almost pretty definitely Wednesday. The rest of it is a little bit dicey. Like I say, we get to about 80, maybe 85% certainty. We know how this week played out. And as you kind of do your own meditation, I just provide that so you see how that kind of operates. I want to finish up our discussion on authority and power in the church, and I want to do it very simply today. I just wanted to talk about the fact that there are only two authorities in our Lutheran congregations. You take a look at any Lutheran constitution and bylaws, any one of them. We have two in front of us right now here at Mount Olive, and the one thing they have in common is that there are really only two authorities in a Lutheran congregation. One is the authority of the office of the ministry, and the other is the church's authority, again, tasked out in voters' assembly. Let's do a quick review. Authority versus power. Authority is the better term in the New Testament. Authority is something that's always shared from author to authorized. It is usually defined in some sort of printed document. For instance, if you think about authority in our United States government, the authorities and their limits are defined really in the U.S. Constitution. For us, they are, for pastors, they're defined largely in the scriptures. For the congregation, they're defined in the scriptures and their congregational constitutions. But in all of this, it's Jesus who authorizes those with authority to do whatever. Authority is always limited. It's not limitless. It's always limited to the author's intent, again, as it's printed out in those other documents. And authority is best understood not under leadership, for instance, who's the boss, but rather under service. Matthew 20, which I talked about before, where Jesus tells the disciples, the Gentiles do all the lording over. That's not how it's going to work in my church. Power is the opposite. Power is not the good word in the New Testament. Power is nearly always taken rather than shared. Power seeks always to be as unlimited as possible. And when people who are under authority, that's what I talked about in the last one, seek to exceed the limitations of the authority shared with them, we call this a corruption or a tyranny. I wanted to talk a little bit about, when Christ is the author and you have these two authorities in the church, you have the office of the ministry and you have the church, which is really embodied in the voters' assembly. What's the best way to do this? What's the best way to understand this? You'll notice that if you've ever watched the Supreme Court carefully, the Supreme Court, when it's making rulings on the U.S. Constitution, talks about two concepts. One is the letter of the law, and the other is the spirit of the law. And in all honesty, I really think that what happens to congregations when they start to overlook their Constitution and bylaws, and they do, many congregations do it, I would argue probably the majority of them do it quite often, but unfortunately, it's when they do that they wind up creating a lot of the unhealth and conflict in the church too. That Constitution, at least for you in the voters' assembly, is your contract with those you elected for how they are supposed to do their jobs. You're putting a trust in their hands that's defined by that Constitution, so you got to pay attention to it. And it's impossible for a church to honor the full letter of their documents perfectly all the time. Mistakes are going to be made in that regard. What you don't want is it to become cultural, that we just ignore it altogether. And so one of the things I think is really helpful is trying to remember the spirit of the Constitution too, or the spirit of the scriptures as well, which kind of puts everything back under that whole idea of servants. Pastors are servants. That's what you see on the screen here. They serve Christ by the tasks that were mentioned before in earlier podcasts, but they also serve God's people with the gifts that they need the most, and pastors serve Christ as they serve God's people. So if I'm not serving you with what Christ wants me to serve you with, then I'm not serving you at that point. So word and sacrament, those are central to all of that. But the same idea is true of the church. And again, the voice of the church in the Constitution is the voters' assembly, but that's the reason. The reason is because they speak for the church. The church serves Christ in obedience to his word. I put Ephesians 5 in here because, and this is the section on marriage, quite interestingly, but that's what Paul does with it. Paul says that the wife's responsibility to the husband is based on the church's responsibility to Christ and to one another. All Christians, Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then he goes on and says, well, wives, submit to your husbands, which means nothing more than be a Christian to your husband. It's not the husband, and when it talks about the husband as the head of the household, it's not the lord of the manor or the ruler of the roost or the king of the castle. That's not what he means there. He means that if the husband does what he's supposed to do, which is love his wife and sacrifice for her, she would have no trouble submitting to him. And even, I think the idea isn't just to him, but for him and for his good and for his well-being. The church does this too. The church serves Christ. It submits to Christ, and in the process, it submits to one another. So it serves one another as a model for serving the outside world. The outside world doesn't get this. The power politics of our world today, that's not about service. It's not about service at all. I really find it interesting to sometimes go on social media and see a politician criticize another politician for lying. I mean, to be quite honest with you, don't they all? It's a little bit hypocritical. So I think it's important to just understand that service helps us get the spirit of our documents right, even when sometimes we're going to get the letter wrong. If the voters' assembly can see that the people they've elected are really putting them first and putting the best information in front of them and giving them the room to make important decisions, well, you got service going on at that point. Otherwise, it's just lording it over. If the people you elect are just making the decisions and telling you about it later, that's lording it over. What you want is service. Lastly, the church serves Christ as it internally serves one another and externally witnesses to the world. In other words, you want to get this stuff right. You want to get power versus authority right. You want to get authority better than power and have that more. You want to have as healthy a congregation as possible. Everybody, pastor and people, should take an attitude of service. Be slaves of Christ, servants to one another. Consider the other person's needs more important than your own. That's what love is. That's how love is defined. Any pursuing of your own ideas or my own ideas, at the bottom line of Scriptures, that's just quite simply unloving, and that is probably the biggest part of the problem. In a lot of ways, is that's where that winds up going. It winds up going into an unloving direction, and the healthiest congregations are the ones that work together lovingly, that serve one another. What you see me doing on Sunday morning might look like leadership to the world, but I'm serving Christ and I'm serving you in that process. And, even like this podcast, or hopefully most of the other stuff you see me do, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing me do all that serving. Well, it is Holy Week. It is, you always, as long as I've been a pastor, people have always talked about, how busy I am this time of year. I'm happy to report that I, even at the end of last week and now through these early days of Holy Week, I'm going to be getting out and doing shut-in visits, because I do not want our shut-ins to feel disconnected from the church, especially at Christmas and Easter. So if I do my job right, we're all set for the services on the weekend, and I have time to go do that so that I can help those people who can't be here this weekend still feel like they're part of it and still feel like they're part of the whole situation. I've learned over the years that Lent and Holy Week are only as busy as you allow them to be. So sometimes when you say to me, well, Pastor, it's that time of year and you're so busy, it's only somewhat true. It's busy in a different way, and services don't stress me out. Preaching a little bit. I get the butterflies before I preach, but generally speaking, I could do probably 20 services a week. I don't think that would burn me out. It's a lot of the other tasks that kind of get you at times. But we're coming in strong to this week. I'm really happy with the themes that we've got coming ahead for Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday. Remember, service at 6:30 on Monday, Thursday, Friday, noon and 6:30. I've been misreporting this. I've got this stuck in my head the wrong way, I guess. But the services are at noon and at 6:30, just like the midweeks. And Sunday is 6:30 and 9:30. Saturday evening, 6:30 p.m. We published that wrong. We had it at 6 o'clock. 6:30 p.m. Easter Vigil at Calvary. We participate in that service. I will be participating in that service. We had a really great crowd from Mount Olivet last year. And we do our own little version of Easter Vigil at the sunrise service. Some of the traditions that I inherited here with regard to the sunrise service are actually borrowed from that Easter Vigil service, which is why I was inclined to say to Pastor Strawn at Calvary, keep the vigil. We'll help you with that, but let's keep doing it there. Because we do have our own little version of it. We just hold it off to Sunday morning, but it's a marvelous thing. Last year was my first Easter because 2 years ago right now I was in the hospital and I was not able to do Easter. And I was actually pretty impressed with it. I was very happy with the traditions that we have here, and I don't see any need to change them. But maybe, just kind of reinforce them when we bring everything back into the church at the sunrise service. That's borrowed straight from the vigil, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Great tradition for us to have. So I hope to see you later this week at all the services. Stick around for breakfast between the services on Easter Sunday, and I hope you all have a blessed Holy Week and a very happy Easter. I hope to see you soon. Take care. God bless. It's the Better Message. Goodbye.